In today's session, I am going to talk about certain aspects of T.S. Eliot's famous critical essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. As we all know, tradition and the individual talent is considered to be a kind of a manifesto of modernist poetry, just as Preface to the Lyrical Ballads is considered to be a manifesto of romantic poetry, British romantic poetry, to be precise. Now, I have in my last lecture given you a thumbnail sketch of the drift of Eliot's arguments in the essay Tradition and the Individual Talent. Now, there are certain things about the essay that need to be highlighted. For example, there is the theory of impersonality. T.S. Eliot, with his marked classicist leanings, wanted poets to consider and conform to tradition, but that in a constructive way, not in a blindly imitative manner. He wanted poetry not to be a letting loose of personality, but in a way, a withdrawal from personality. Now, here, T.S. Eliot has committed one very grievous error, the error of misquotation. T.S. Eliot refers to two particular phrases from Wordsworth. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And then he points out how, according to him, Wordsworth had at another place called poetry, an emotion recollected in tranquility. Now, this is a bit askew because the original statement from the preface to the lyrical ballads was that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that has its origin in emotions recollected in time. Now, T.S. Eliot has failed to, or chosen not to, indicate or understand that Wordsworth was trying to point out the poetic process. In our lives, we get to experience many things. We may experience sense impressions as well as certain thoughts caused by those impressions. Now, T.S. Eliot seems to say that one has to be more objective and critical in dealing with those sense impressions and experiences and thoughts. Because he at different times considered the poet's mind to be the receptacle of impressions and also the catalyst to facilitate the poetic process from impression to expression. Now, so far as T.S. Eliot's understanding of tradition is concerned, he advocates a very, very clear cut historical sense in poetry. Poets and readers, according to him, should have a sense of history, what has already been done in the realm of poetry. But then, what is the importance of individual talent? Even though the title of T.S. Eliot's essay is Tradition and the Individual Talent, if you read the text, you will see that nowhere within it does he repeat the phrase individual talent. But the question is, does this fact make the essay a misnomer? Has T.S. Eliot had nothing to say about individual talent or the role of the individual, poet as individual? No, he has done that in a roundabout way. And that's why, as I had discussed it in my last lecture also, there is always room for and very important role of the individual who can enrich the tradition with the supervention of novelty. Because with the writing of a new poem, tradition is added to and disturbed at the same time. Now, so far as the role of the poet is concerned, T.S. Eliot seems to say that originality lies not in the choice of subject, but in the treatment of that subject. The way a new poet deals with the perennial, unchanging store of human experience. Therein lies the differentia of great poetry. Okay. So far as the importance of the three topics that I have chosen as to be seriously studied by you, I would request one of you to read those three topics.
Yes, sir. Bring out the significance of the title of T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent.
I
The
have
second,
discussed the significance of the title both in my previous lecture and today also. Okay,
yes,
next.
the second one is discuss T.S. Eliot's views on the nature of the poetic process. Answer with a special reference to his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent.
Yes, poetic process also I have discussed. And here, there is an erroneous chemical reaction given by T.S. Eliot, and much ink has been spilled over the scientific inaccuracy of this chemical reaction that T.S. Eliot has given us. But what T.S. Eliot actually tries to point out is not something that is very, very uncommon. You remember that S.T. Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, had once talked about the secondary imagination, which he called exemplastic imagination, that could diffuse and recreate in an entirely different way. You remember Philip Sidney had pointed out, whereas the world of nature is brazen, the world of art is golden. The role of the individual who is writing poetry, who is creating art, is something that cannot be totally ignored. And here, actually, T.S. Eliot seems to contradict himself. Therein lies a kind of a romantic journey undertaken by the modernist poet T.S. Eliot. In the poetic process, the poet's role is talismanic. T.S. Eliot may couch his thought in different words, but he has not been able to negate the role of the poet altogether as a creative individual, as someone who adds to the value. Okay, and what is the next topic?
Yes, sir. Critically examine T.S. Eliot's views on tradition.
Now, I have also discussed this. T.S. Eliot's views on tradition is something that I have also discussed. Now, T.S. Eliot tries to highlight the role of tradition, and it had certain reasons. You know, T.S. Eliot was a scholar. T.S. Eliot's basic approach to poetry was intellectual. This is something we have to understand. So, he was not so much an instinctive poet. He was more of a bookish poet. If you read the Westland, you will see the same thing happening. The way he alludes to and deals with almost countless events, incidents, and information from history, the arts, literature, mythology, science, popular culture, and so on and so forth. And that too from various climes, various locales, from various language and literary traditions. You can very easily understand that his is basically a poetics that is at once referential and reflexive. So I have also provided you some materials with some materials that will help you in understanding and tackling these questions. With this, we come to the end of T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent. And we will have to, after this, talk about Virginia Woolf's famous essay, Modern Fiction. I have already given you some idea of T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, because the other component of this unit is modern fiction. I will have to deal with it. So I will today only give you an idea of Virginia Woolf as an individual and as a writer. Virginia Woolf was the daughter of one of the eminent Victorians, as Lytton Strachey is in his very famous and notorious book, The Eminent Victorians, has pointed out. Virginia Woolf was the daughter of Leslie Stevens. She came from a very intellectual and literary background. In those days, you know, women were not encouraged to study in schools. So Virginia Woolf was educated at home. But she had the freedom of her father's well stocked library, and she was a voracious reader. Along with her siblings, she became almost an omnivorous reader. From the very beginning, she was exposed to the important intellectual currents of the day. Later on, when she grew up, after the sisters married, and Virginia Woolf was married to Leonard Woolf, an important writer and editor. Now, there was a place at Bloomsbury. In those days, it was a suburb of London. This particular house of Virginia and Leonard Woolf, it was frequented by the who's who of contemporary intellectual background in England. People like Keynes, Fry, Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, Leonard Woolf. Even there were fringe figures like E.M. Foster and others. Now, they actually came to this place, and they were at that time called or known as the Bloomsbury Group. They met at the house of Virginia and Leonard. Now, they were all influenced by More's Principia Ethica. Their slogan was make something new, make it new. Now, this making things new was commensurate with the aesthetic agenda of modernism on the one hand and the drift of contemporary science on the other. We all know that literature as a reflection of life has much to do with science. You know, the prevalent world outlook propagated by contemporary science greatly influences literature. Now, we have to know and understand as well that Einstein at this time was propagating his famous formula of E equals to mc square. This meant that the age old belief in the indestructibility of matter, in the unchangeability of the world, for that matter, there was an error. You know, into energy, excuse me, then obviously the givenness of reality is questioned. Earlier, the stability accorded to reality was because of the Newtonian worldview that matter is imperishable. Now, this is something that was set to naught by by Einstein's theory. So obviously, reality shifted its focus from physical to psychological. As a result, modern fiction also changed. You know, in my next class, I will talk about, on the one hand, the emergence of the stream of consciousness novelists and the anger and annoyance that they felt at the blunders of the preceding generation of writers, most of them. So, next day, I'm going to talk about just that. If any guys or girls have any questions to ask me, feel free.
Sir,
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sandeep
I would like to know about the supervention of novelty as dictated by T.S. Eliot. Is it a kind of freshness of observation?
I have already discussed it, not only once but twice. Novelty is, so I would strongly suggest that you guys actually give more attention to the class. You see, supervention of novelty means a novelty of approach. Every writer, while treating the same subject, has his or her new or unique response to it. So thereby, tradition is not only added to, but reoriented by every poet worth his salt. Every writer who should be taken seriously has to have that capacity of not only adding to the tradition, but also jarring it, disturbing it, and reconstructing it in an ever so slight a manner. It is supervention means some kind of an addition of novelty. That actually gives the freshness to every work, a new work of art. Any other question?
Sir, I was asking that how do we differentiate impersonality from uh, objectivity, sir?
You know, impersonality means the ability to check one's emotions. Impersonality has got much to do with objectivity because that is something that it gives. But it has got much to do with restraint also. Now, T.S. Eliot seems to say that every work of poetry, every work of literature should be polished. So, there should be not only the exuberance, the emotional charge, spontaneity, but there should also be the deliberation of art. Any artistic work, be it a, be it a poem, a painting, or whatever, has to have, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Has to have that kind of a balance between emotion and ratiocination, intellect. Only emotion will give us an uncontrolled expression. But the artistic value of a poem needs to be painstakingly acquired. So there is not only spontaneity, there has to be some deliberation. Okay.
Sir,
Any other question?
sir, as we know from the romantic view on poetry that poets are supposed to be impulsive, but as as we see from the views of T.S. Eliot that uh, poets should be so restrained in their.
You see, the thing is, you should read another essay by T.S. Eliot, that is the Metaphysical Poets. Now, he has talked about two things: unified sensibility and dissociation of sensibility. He told us that after Blake, there was a dissociation of sensibility where emotion got the upper hand. According to him, he was a great lover and a champion of the metaphysical poets. He thought that in metaphysical poetry there is a right balance between emotion and intellect. Because he was a practicing critic, he was writing as well as he was critiquing the writings of others. He was a critical as well as a creative writer. That is why there are certain prejudices, certain bias that he had. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Sir, I would like to know about the secondary imagination of ST Coleridge. Is it the willing suspension of disbelief?
No, this is what is your name?
Sandipon Roy.
Sandipon, this is you should study harder. Willing suspension of disbelief is something else. Willing suspension of disbelief actually constitutes poetic faith. Now, I am not actually here to teach you either William Wordsworth or Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but because you are a student and you have asked me, I should actually tell you something. But this is not what I am here for. You see, um, willing suspension of disbelief was a phrase that William Wordsworth used in a different context. He was talking about we all know that in the lyrical ballads published in 1798, Wordsworth and Coleridge had collaborated. It is actually a volume of poetry, volume of poems written by both these poets. And in preface to the lyrical ballads, William Wordsworth was trying to point out, explain why these two poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, had collaborated in writing this lyrical ballads. Now, Wordsworth had tried to point out that they dealt with two different but interconnected realms. Wordsworth was dealing with natural, everyday themes and trying to defamiliarize them, if I may use a term from the vocabulary of Russian formalism. He was basically trying to add a new dimension of unfamiliarity to this everyday things. Whereas, in the case of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he was dealing with supernatural things. So you have read poems like Kubla Khan, like
Christabel.
Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and Christabel. But he was trying to, he means here S.T. Coleridge or Samuel Taylor Coleridge. According to William Wordsworth, Coleridge was trying to familiarize the unfamiliar. And this actually led to a willing suspension of disbelief that constituted poetic faith for those creation of fancy. Now, exemplastic imagination or secondary imagination is something that the idea of which has been propagated by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in biographical literature. That is a totally different thing. He seemed to say that a poet as an individual had a primary imagination, like all of us, but he was blessed with a secondary imagination that could help him in finding out newer significance and newer meanings in even familiar things. So he could diffuse and recreate, dissipate, diffuse, and recreate with the magic touch of his imagination. So it was all about adding value to the world of senses. I hope this has satisfied you, Sandipan. You
Thank
guys
you, sir.
should read. You guys should read more. Okay. Okay. If there are no other questions, are there any other questions? If not, then we will shut shop today.
Okay, sir.
Okay. In that case, you remove me from this
Okay,
meeting.
sir.